The ocean holds secrets that would make your blood run cold. Tonight, as you settle into the darkness of your room, I want you to imagine the vast expanse of black water stretching endlessly in every direction. Now imagine being alone on that water when something impossible happens. Something that defies every law of nature and reason you thought you knew. What you're about to hear are 5 maritime mysteries so terrifying, so inexplicable, that they've haunted investigators for decades. These aren't just stories. These are real events that happen to real people who live to tell tales that will make you question everything you believe about our world. Each of these mysteries will take you deeper into the abyss of the unknown, each one more disturbing than the last. And by the end, you'll understand why even the most experienced sailors refuse to speak of what they've witnessed in the darkest corners of our oceans. So turn off your lights, put in your headphones, and prepare yourself for a journey into the most terrifying maritime mysteries ever recorded. But I warn you, once you hear these stories, you'll never look at the ocean the same way again. It's 1872, and you're standing on the deck of a British merchant vessel cutting through the Atlantic waters between Portugal and Gibraltar. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the choppy sea, when suddenly your lookout shouts something that makes your blood freeze. There, emerging from the evening mist like something from a nightmare, is a ship sailing directly toward you. But this isn't just any ship. This is the Mary Celeste, and everyone in maritime circles knows her name. What they don't know is why she's here, sailing perfectly, with her sails set and her cargo intact, but without a single soul aboard. The Mary Celeste had left New York just weeks earlier with Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and 7 experienced crew members. They were bound for Genoa with a cargo of denatured alcohol. Everything was routine. Everything was normal, until it wasn't. When the British ship Dei Grazia spotted the Mary Celeste drifting between Portugal and Gibraltar, Captain David Morehouse immediately knew something was wrong. The ship was sailing erratically, her sails partially set, moving like a drunk person stumbling through the night. There was no response to their signals, no signs of life aboard. Morehouse ordered a boarding party to investigate, and what they found defied all logic. The ship was in perfect condition. Her cargo was intact, barely touched. The captain's quarters showed signs of recent habitation. A half-eaten meal sat on the table, still fresh. The captain's wife's sewing lay scattered as if she had just put it down. Child's toys were arranged neatly in the cabin. But here's where the mystery becomes truly terrifying. In the captain's cabin, they found the ship's log. The last entry was dated November 25th, 10 days before the ship was discovered. It was written in Captain Briggs' own handwriting, documenting their position near the Azores. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, just a routine entry from a man who had no idea he was about to vanish forever. The boarding party searched every inch of the vessel. They found personal belongings untouched. They found valuable cargo worth thousands of dollars left behind. They found no signs of violence, no signs of struggle, no signs of piracy. What they didn't find was any trace of the 10 people who should have been aboard. The ship's only lifeboat was missing, but here's what makes this detail so chilling. Maritime experts calculated that in the weather conditions at the time, a small lifeboat would never have survived the journey to shore. The nearest land was hundreds of miles away across treacherous waters. Even if the crew had abandoned ship for some unknown reason, they would have faced certain death in that tiny boat. But why would they abandon a seaworthy vessel? The Mary Celeste showed no signs of distress. Her hull was sound, her masts intact, her cargo secure. There was no fire, no flood, no structural damage that would force a crew to take to the lifeboats. Yet somehow, 10 people had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt maritime investigators for over a century. Some theorized piracy, but pirates would have taken the valuable cargo. Others suggested mutiny, but mutineers would have sailed the ship to a safe port, not abandoned her in the middle of the ocean. Weather couldn't explain it. Mechanical failure couldn't explain it. Nothing could explain how 10 people could simply disappear from a perfectly seaworthy vessel. The Mary Celeste was towed to Gibraltar, where maritime authorities launched an investigation that revealed even more disturbing details. The ship's compass had been destroyed, deliberately broken. Some of the rigging had been damaged, but not by weather or accident. The damage patterns suggested human intervention, as if someone had been trying to disable the ship's navigation systems. In the captain's cabin, investigators found something that still sends shivers down the spines of maritime historians. Hidden beneath some papers, they discovered a sword with what appeared to be bloodstains. But when tested, the stains proved to be rust, not blood. Yet the very presence of a drawn sword suggested that Captain Briggs had been prepared to defend his family against something. But what? The cargo hold revealed another chilling detail. Several barrels of denatured alcohol had been opened and then carefully resealed. The alcohol levels were exactly as they should be, ruling out drinking or spillage. But someone had opened those barrels during the voyage. Someone had been down in that cargo hold after the ship left New York. The question was who and why. Years later, researchers would discover that denatured alcohol could produce dangerous fumes under certain conditions. Some theorized that the crew might have detected gas leaks and abandoned ship, fearing an explosion. But this theory fell apart under scrutiny. Experienced sailors would never abandon a ship for potential gas fumes, especially not in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The Mary Celeste mystery deepened when investigators learned about Captain Briggs himself. He was no inexperienced sailor. Benjamin Briggs had been sailing for over 20 years. He was known for his caution, his professionalism, and his devotion to his family. He had even brought his wife and young daughter on this voyage because he considered it routine and safe. This was not a man who would abandon his ship without the most compelling reason imaginable. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Mary Celeste mystery is what happened to those who tried to solve it. The ship was eventually sold and put back into service, but she seemed cursed. Over the next 13 years, the Mary Celeste changed hands 17 times. Every owner suffered financial ruin. Every captain who sailed her reported strange occurrences, unexplained sounds, and an overwhelming sense of dread that settled over the crew like a burial shroud. The final chapter of the Mary Celeste came in 1885, when her last owner deliberately wrecked her on a reef off Haiti in an insurance fraud scheme. Even then, the ship refused to sink easily, as if the ocean itself was reluctant to claim her. When she finally went down, local fishermen reported seeing strange lights rising from the water where she sank, lights that continued to appear for years afterward. But the story doesn't end there. Even today, more than 150 years later, maritime researchers continue to investigate the Mary Celeste mystery. New theories emerge regularly, each one attempting to explain the impossible. Yet none have succeeded in solving the fundamental question that has haunted sailors for generations. What could cause 10 people to abandon a perfectly seaworthy ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, leaving behind their most precious possessions, their food, their safety, and their lives? What terror was so overwhelming that it drove experienced sailors to choose almost certain death in a small lifeboat over staying aboard their secure vessel? The answer may lie in the vast darkness of the ocean itself, in forces beyond our understanding that operate in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, forces that can make 10 people vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions that grow more frightening with each passing year. But the Mary Celeste was just the beginning of our journey into maritime horror. What we'll discover next makes her mystery seem almost mundane by comparison. If you thought the Mary Celeste was disturbing, What I'm about to tell you will make that mystery seem like a gentle bedtime story. This is the tale of a ship where death came not as a quiet disappearance, but as a screaming, terrifying presence that left every soul aboard frozen in expressions of pure, unimaginable horror. The year was 1948, and radio operators across Southeast Asia began picking up a distress signal that would become the stuff of nightmares. The transmission crackled through the static, weak and desperate, coming from somewhere in the waters of the Strait of Malacca between Malaysia and Sumatra. The voice on the radio was barely human, strained and breaking with terror as it repeated the same horrifying message over and over. All officers, including captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge. Possibly whole crew dead. Then, after a pause that seemed to last forever, the voice returned, more desperate now, more afraid. I die. The transmission ended in silence. Not the clean silence of a radio being switched off, but the dead silence of a voice that would never speak again. The distress call was triangulated to a Dutch cargo ship called the Ourang Medan. 2 merchant vessels in the area, the American ship Silver Star and a British vessel, immediately changed course to render assistance. What they found when they reached the Ourang Medan's coordinates would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The ship appeared normal from a distance. She was floating upright, undamaged, showing no signs of fire or collision. Her hull was intact, her superstructure undamaged. But as the Silver Star drew closer, the rescue crew noticed something that made their blood run cold. There was no movement aboard the Ourang Medan. No one on deck, no response to their signals. The ship sat in the water like a tomb, silent and still as death itself. Captain Meyer of the Silver Star ordered a boarding party to investigate. The men who climbed aboard the Ourang Medan that day would never be the same again. What they found defied every natural law, every rational explanation, every comforting belief about the way the world was supposed to work. The first body they encountered was the radio operator, slumped over his equipment in the communications room. But this wasn't a peaceful death. The man's face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his eyes wide open, staring at something that had filled him with such fear that his final moments had been burned into his features like a death mask. His mouth was open in a silent scream that would never end. The boarding party moved through the ship like men walking through hell itself. In the chart room, they found the captain and his officers all dead, all wearing the same expression of overwhelming terror. Their faces were contorted in horror so profound that several of the rescue crew had to step outside to vomit. But it wasn't just the officers. The entire crew was dead. In the engine room, they found the engineers frozen at their posts, their faces locked in the same terrified expression. On deck, they discovered sailors who had died while performing routine tasks, as if death had taken them instantly, without warning, in the middle of their normal duties. Even the ship's dog was found dead, its face twisted in what could only be described as animal terror. Whatever had killed the crew of the Ourang Medan had spared nothing and no one aboard that cursed vessel. The boarding party leader, an experienced sailor who had seen death in many forms during the war, later reported that the temperature aboard the ship was wrong. Despite the tropical heat of Southeast Asia, the air inside the Ourang Medan was cold, unnaturally cold, as if winter had somehow taken residence in the ship's compartments. But the most disturbing discovery came when they examined the bodies more closely. Despite the tropical climate and the time that had passed since the distress call, none of the corpses showed any signs of decomposition. They looked fresh, as if death had only just claimed them. Yet their skin was cold to the touch, colder than the surrounding air, colder than death itself should be. Medical examination would later reveal that the crew had died with their blood vessels dilated and their pupils contracted to pinpoints. These are not symptoms of any known poison or disease. These are symptoms of something far more sinister, something that medical science couldn't explain then and still struggles to understand today. As the boarding party continued their investigation, they noticed other disturbing details. The ship's cargo hold was filled with unmarked crates and barrels. When they tried to examine the contents, they found that many of the containers were sealed with warnings written in multiple languages. Warnings about dangerous chemicals, about substances that should never be exposed to air or heat. The manifest listed the cargo as general freight, but the boarding party soon realized they were looking at something far more sinister. Hidden among the legitimate cargo were containers of chemicals that had no business being on a merchant vessel. Chemicals that could be used for weapons. Chemicals that could kill. But even this discovery couldn't explain what had happened to the crew. Chemical exposure might account for death, but it couldn't explain the expressions of terror on every face, the unnatural cold that permeated the ship, or the perfect preservation of the bodies in tropical heat. As the boarding party prepared to tow the Ourang Medan to port for a full investigation, something happened that turned an already terrifying mystery into an absolute nightmare. Smoke began rising from the cargo hold. Not the black smoke of fire, but a strange, greenish smoke that seemed to writhe and move with a life of its own. The temperature aboard the ship began to rise rapidly, but not from normal combustion. The air itself seemed to become heavy and oppressive, pressing down on the rescue crew like a physical weight. Several men reported feeling dizzy, nauseous, overwhelmed by a sense of impending doom that seemed to emanate from the ship itself. Captain Meyer, recognizing the danger, ordered his men to cut the tow lines immediately. As the Silver Star pulled away, the smoke from the Ourang Medan's cargo hold intensified, rising into the sky like a pillar of green death. Then, without warning, the ship exploded. But this wasn't a normal explosion. Witnesses reported that the blast seemed to come from within the ship itself, as if something inside the Ourang Medan had been fighting to get out and had finally succeeded. The explosion sent debris flying in all directions, but the pieces that landed in the water didn't float. They sank immediately, as if the ocean itself was eager to swallow any trace of the cursed vessel. Within minutes, the Ourang Medan was gone, taking with her all evidence of what had killed her crew and all hope of solving the mystery. The only things that remained were the testimonies of the men who had boarded her and the radio recordings of that final, desperate distress call. In the years that followed, investigators tried to piece together what had happened aboard the Ourang Medan. Some theories focused on the mysterious cargo, suggesting that chemical weapons being secretly transported had leaked and killed the crew. Others pointed to more exotic explanations involving experimental nerve agents or biological weapons left over from the war. But none of these theories could explain the expressions of terror on the crew's faces, the unnatural cold aboard the ship, or the strange preservation of the bodies. None could account for the way the ship seemed to develop a malevolent presence of its own, or the green smoke that rose from her cargo hold like something from another world. Some researchers have suggested that the Ourang Medan was carrying cargo that was never meant to exist, substances that operated according to laws of physics that we don't understand. Others believe that the crew encountered something during their voyage, something that boarded their ship and brought death with it like a plague. The Dutch authorities, who would have been responsible for investigating the incident, claimed to have no record of a ship called the Ourang Medan in their registry. This led some to suggest that the entire story was a hoax, but the testimonies of multiple witnesses, the recorded radio transmissions, and the detailed accounts of the boarding party make this explanation unlikely. What's more probable is that the Ourang Medan was operating under false papers, carrying cargo that was never meant to be documented, serving purposes that were never meant to be known. In the chaos following World War II, many ships operated in the shadows, transporting materials and conducting business that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal, between known and unknown. But even if we accept that the Ourang Medan was engaged in some form of covert operation, this still doesn't explain what killed her crew or why they died with such expressions of absolute terror. It doesn't explain the unnatural cold, the preserved bodies, or the green smoke that preceded the ship's destruction. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Ourang Medan mystery is the pattern it established. In the decades since 1948, there have been other reports of ships found with their crews dead, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, their bodies unnaturally preserved. Each incident shares similarities with the Ourang Medan case, suggesting that whatever claimed that ship and her crew might still be out there, waiting in the dark waters of our world's oceans. The Ourang Medan reminds us that the sea holds secrets that were never meant to be disturbed, forces that operate beyond our understanding or control. But as terrifying as this story is, it's merely the second chapter in our journey into maritime horror. What awaits us next will make even the damned crew of the Ourang Medan seem fortunate by comparison. Some mysteries emerge from the fog of history gradually, revealing their horror piece by terrifying piece. But others announce themselves with such dramatic force that they become legends overnight. The case of the Carroll A. Deering falls into this second category, a maritime mystery so bizarre, so completely inexplicable, that it captured the imagination of an entire nation and spawned investigations that continued for decades. It was January 31st, 1921, when the lighthouse keeper at Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, spotted something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A massive 5-masted schooner was running aground on the treacherous Outer Banks, her sails set perfectly for navigation, her hull gleaming white against the gray winter sky. She was the Carroll A. Deering, and she was sailing directly toward the graveyard of the Atlantic with no one at the helm. The Carroll A. Deering was no ordinary vessel. Built in 1919, she was one of the largest commercial sailing ships ever constructed, a magnificent specimen of maritime engineering designed to carry cargo across the world's most challenging seas. At 255 feet long with 5 towering masts, she was a sight that commanded respect from even the most experienced sailors. The ship had left Norfolk, Virginia, in August 1920, bound for Rio de Janeiro with a cargo of coal. Captain William Merritt, a veteran sailor with decades of experience, commanded a crew of 11 men. The voyage to Brazil had been routine, profitable, and without incident. But somewhere on the return journey, something happened that would transform the Carroll A. Deering from a working merchant vessel into America's most famous ghost ship. When the Coast Guard reached the grounded vessel, they found something that defied all logic and maritime experience. The ship was in perfect condition, her sails properly set, her rigging intact. But there wasn't a single soul aboard. The entire crew of 12 men, including Captain Merritt, had vanished without a trace. The initial investigation revealed details that made the mystery even more disturbing. The ship's navigation equipment was missing, deliberately removed by someone who knew exactly what they were taking. The logs had been torn from their bindings, not lost in a storm or accident, but carefully extracted as if someone was trying to hide the ship's recent history. In the galley, investigators found food that had been prepared for a meal but never served. Pots sat on the stove with partially cooked food inside, as if the cook had been interrupted in the middle of preparation and had simply walked away. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the crew quarters, but in patterns that suggested hasty packing rather than storm damage or struggle. Most disturbing of all, the ship's lifeboats were missing, but not in the way that would indicate an emergency evacuation. The boats had been lowered properly, professionally, by people who knew what they were doing. This wasn't a panicked abandonment in the face of immediate danger. This was a deliberate, organized evacuation of the entire crew. But why would 12 experienced sailors abandon a seaworthy vessel? The Carroll A. Deering showed no signs of damage, no evidence of fire or flood, no structural problems that would necessitate abandoning ship. Her cargo was intact, her hull sound, her equipment functional. There was no rational reason for the crew to take to the lifeboats in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The Coast Guard investigation quickly expanded into a full federal inquiry when investigators realized the implications of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a missing crew. This was a perfectly preserved maritime mystery that seemed to defy every known law of seamanship and survival. As news of the Carroll A. Deering spread, similar reports began surfacing from other vessels in the area. During the same time period, several other ships had gone missing or been found abandoned in the waters off Cape Hatteras. The steamship Hewitt had vanished without a trace. The tanker Amalco had been found drifting empty. A pattern was emerging, a pattern that suggested something systematic was happening in those waters. The investigation took a darker turn when authorities learned about the ship's final known communication. On January 29th, 2 days before running aground, the Carroll A. Deering had been spotted by the Cape Lookout lightship. A man aboard the schooner had shouted across the water that the ship had lost her anchors and was requesting that her owners be notified. But lighthouse keepers later reported something disturbing about this encounter. The man who had done the shouting wasn't Captain Merritt. The voice, the appearance, even the way the man carried himself suggested he was not the ship's legitimate commander. Someone else was in charge of the Carroll A. Deering during her final days, someone who had no business being there. This revelation opened up possibilities that investigators were reluctant to consider but couldn't ignore. Had the Carroll A. Deering been the victim of piracy? In 1921, the idea seemed almost laughably obsolete, but the evidence pointed towards some form of organized takeover of the vessel. Further investigation revealed that Captain Merritt had reported tensions with his crew during the voyage to Brazil. Several crew members had been disciplined for insubordination, and there had been discussions about replacing some of the men in Rio de Janeiro. Could this tension have escalated into mutiny on the return voyage? The mutiny theory gained credibility when investigators learned about the ship's first mate, Charles McClellan. Several witnesses in Barbados, where the ship had stopped for supplies, reported that McClellan had been drinking heavily and making threats against Captain Merritt. He had been overheard saying that he would get the captain before the voyage was over. But the mutiny theory, like all the others, fell apart under scrutiny. If the crew had mutinied and taken control of the ship, why would they abandon her? The Carroll A. Deering was valuable, her cargo worth thousands of dollars. Mutineers would have sailed the ship to a safe port and sold everything, not abandoned her to run aground on Cape Hatteras. As the investigation continued, even more bizarre details emerged. The ship's cats, normally kept aboard to control rats, were missing along with the crew. This detail might seem insignificant, but experienced investigators knew it was crucial. Sailors might abandon ship in an emergency, but they would never take the time to collect cats unless they were planning a permanent departure. The missing cats suggested that whatever happened to the Carroll A. Deering's crew, it wasn't a sudden emergency. It was a planned evacuation, organized and executed by people who had time to gather animals and personal belongings. But planned by whom and why? The federal investigation, led by the Commerce Department and assisted by the Navy, Coast Guard, and Justice Department, generated thousands of pages of reports and interviews. They investigated theories ranging from piracy to espionage to supernatural intervention. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, examined physical evidence, and consulted with maritime experts from around the world. Yet after months of intensive investigation, they reached a conclusion that was more disturbing than any single theory. The fate of the Carroll A. Deering and her crew was, in their official words, one of the most baffling mysteries in the annals of the sea. The case officially remained open for decades, with periodic reviews and new investigations launched whenever new evidence surfaced. But no theory ever fully explained what happened during those final days of January 1921. The Carroll A. Deering had simply become another victim of the sea's refusal to give up her secrets. Some researchers have suggested that the ship fell victim to rum runners during Prohibition, pirates of a new era who might have used the vessel for smuggling operations before abandoning her. Others have pointed to international conspiracies, suggesting that foreign agents might have seized the ship for reasons related to post-World War I tensions. But perhaps the most chilling theory is also the simplest. Something happened aboard the Carroll A during her final voyage, something so terrifying that 12 experienced sailors chose to abandon their safe, seaworthy vessel rather than face whatever was coming for them. They took their lifeboats, their cats, their personal belongings, and they sailed off into the Atlantic Ocean, choosing an uncertain fate in small boats over whatever horror awaited them aboard their ship. The Carroll A. Deering reminds us that even in the modern era, even with all our technology and communication systems, the sea remains a realm where the impossible becomes routine and the unexplained becomes legend. But this mystery, as complex and disturbing as it is, represents just the third chapter in our exploration of maritime terror. What awaits us next will make the empty corridors of the Carroll A. Deering seem like a refuge from the true horrors that await in the depths of our ocean's darkest secrets. There are maritime mysteries that leave behind empty ships, and there are others that leave behind broken pieces of vessels with stories too terrifying to fully comprehend. The case of the MV Joyita falls into this second category, a mystery where what was found might be even more disturbing than what disappeared forever into the Pacific's endless blue. October 3rd, 1955. The MV Joyita, a 70-foot merchant vessel, departed Samoa bound for the Tokelau Islands with 25 passengers and crew aboard. Captain Thomas Henry Miller, an experienced Pacific navigator, was confident in his ship and his route. The journey should have taken 2 days at most. It was a routine cargo run, carrying supplies to remote island communities, the kind of voyage that had been completed thousands of times without incident. But the MV Joyita never reached her destination. When she failed to arrive on schedule, authorities in both Samoa and New Zealand launched search operations that covered over 100,000 square miles of Pacific Ocean. For 5 weeks, aircraft and ships scoured the vast blue expanse, looking for any sign of the missing vessel or her passengers and crew. The search found nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no distress signals, no trace of the 25 souls who had simply vanished into the Pacific's immensity. The MV Joyita had become another statistic in the ocean's long catalog of unexplained disappearances, another name added to the growing list of vessels that had sailed into oblivion. But then, on November 10, 1955, 5 weeks after the ship's disappearance, a merchant vessel spotted something floating on the surface of the Pacific, partially submerged and drifting aimlessly in the current. As the rescue ship approached, they realized they had found the MV Joyita, or at least part of her. What they discovered would transform a simple missing vessel case into one of the most baffling maritime mysteries of the modern era. The Joyita was floating partially submerged, her superstructure above water but her hull broken and twisted in ways that defied explanation. She had been found over 600 miles from her intended route, drifting in waters where she had no business being. But the most disturbing discovery was what wasn't there. All 25 passengers and crew members were missing. Every single person who had been aboard when the ship left Samoa had vanished without a trace. Not one body was found on the partially sunken vessel. Not one piece of personal belongings remained to suggest what had happened during those 5 missing weeks. The rescue team's initial examination revealed details that made the mystery even more incomprehensible. The Joyita had been extensively damaged, but not in ways consistent with storm damage or collision. Parts of the superstructure had been deliberately removed. Equipment had been stripped from the vessel systematically, professionally, by people who knew exactly what they were taking. The ship's logbooks were missing, along with all navigation equipment, radio gear, and anything else that might have provided clues about the vessel's final days. But strangest of all, the damage to the hull appeared to have been caused from the inside, as if something aboard the ship had tried to break out rather than something outside trying to break in. When salvage crews managed to partially refloat the Joyita and tow her to port, a more detailed investigation revealed even more disturbing evidence. The cargo hold contained signs of recent habitation by people who weren't part of the original passenger manifest. Food containers, personal items, and makeshift sleeping arrangements suggested that others had been aboard the vessel after her disappearance. But who were these mysterious passengers, and what had happened to the original 25 people who should have been found aboard? The investigation revealed that the Joyita's cargo manifest listed supplies bound for the Tokelau Islands, but customs officials discovered discrepancies in the documentation. Some of the listed cargo was never loaded, while other items not on the manifest were found aboard the partially sunken vessel. Maritime investigators began to suspect that the MV Joyita had been engaged in activities beyond her official cargo run. In the 1950s, the Pacific was home to various illegal operations, from smuggling to gun running to human trafficking. Perhaps the Joyita had become involved in something that led to the disappearance of her passengers and crew. The investigation took a darker turn when authorities discovered that several of the passengers had been traveling under false names. Identity documents found in the wreckage didn't match the passenger manifest, suggesting that some people aboard the Joyita were trying to conceal their true identities. But even this revelation didn't explain what had happened to them or why they had vanished so completely. Forensic examination of the partially submerged vessel revealed evidence of violence. Bloodstains were found in several compartments, but not enough to account for 25 people. Some areas of the ship showed signs of struggle, with furniture overturned and personal belongings scattered in patterns consistent with conflict rather than storm damage. The engine room told its own disturbing story. The engines had been deliberately disabled, not by mechanical failure but by someone who knew exactly how to render them inoperable. Cooling lines had been cut, fuel systems had been sabotaged, and critical components had been removed entirely. The MV Joyita hadn't suffered a breakdown. She had been systematically crippled by human hands. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came when investigators examined the ship's lifeboats. Like the Carroll A. During decades earlier, the Joyita's lifeboats were missing, but the launching equipment showed signs of proper, professional operation. The boats hadn't been torn away by storms or accidents. They had been deliberately lowered by people who knew what they were doing. This evidence suggested that at some point during her missing 5 weeks, the passengers and crew of the MV Joyita had abandoned ship in an organized evacuation. But why would they abandon a vessel that, while damaged, was still partially afloat? And if they had successfully launched the lifeboats, why were they never found? The Pacific Ocean is vast, but it's not empty. In 1955, commercial and military vessels regularly plied the shipping lanes, and small boats would have been spotted by aircraft or other ships. The fact that 25 people in lifeboats had vanished as completely as their original vessel suggested that something had happened to them after they left the Joyita. Some theories focused on piracy, suggesting that the MV Joyita had been attacked by modern pirates who had killed the passengers and crew, looted the vessel, and scuttled her. But pirates would have taken valuable cargo, not left it behind in a partially submerged wreck. They also wouldn't have left the ship floating where it could be discovered. Other investigators suggested that the Joyita had been used for illegal activities and that the passengers and crew had been eliminated to prevent them from testifying about what they had witnessed. This theory explained the false identities, the deliberately damaged engines, and the systematic removal of navigation equipment. But even the most sinister theories couldn't fully explain the MV Joyita mystery. The timeline didn't work. The damage patterns were inconsistent with known forms of maritime violence. The location where the wreck was found made no navigational sense for any of the proposed scenarios. As the investigation continued, one more disturbing detail emerged. Local island communities in the area where the Joyita was found reported seeing lights on the water during the nights leading up to the wreck's discovery. Not the lights of ships or aircraft, but strange, moving lights that seemed to dance across the surface of the Pacific like supernatural phenomena. These reports were initially dismissed as folklore or imagination, but when investigators plotted the sightings on maritime charts, they discovered that the lights had been seen in a pattern that roughly corresponded to the Joyita's drift path. Something had been accompanying the partially submerged vessel during her final journey, something that local witnesses described as unlike anything they had ever seen before. The official investigation into the MV Joyita concluded without reaching a definitive explanation for what had happened to the 25 people who had vanished from the partially sunken vessel. The case was classified as unexplained loss, a maritime euphemism that covers everything from equipment failure to supernatural intervention. But maritime researchers have never stopped trying to solve the mystery. New theories emerge regularly, each attempting to explain the impossible combination of evidence found aboard the wreck. Some focus on Cold War espionage, suggesting that the Joyita had been caught up in international intrigue. Others point to more exotic explanations involving experimental weapons or unexplained phenomena. What's certain is that something happened aboard the MV Joyita during those 5 missing weeks, something that caused 25 people to abandon a floating vessel and disappear forever into the Pacific's endless expanse. Whether that something was human evil, natural disaster, or forces beyond our understanding, we may never know. The partially submerged wreck of the MV Joyita serves as a reminder that the ocean's greatest mysteries aren't always complete disappearances. Sometimes the most terrifying discoveries are the fragments that remain, the broken pieces of stories too horrible to fully reconstruct. But our journey into maritime terror isn't complete yet. What awaits us in our final chapter will make even the twisted wreckage of the MV Joyita seem like a beacon of hope compared to the absolute nightmare that is the SS Waratah, a ship that didn't just disappear but took with her a secret so terrifying that it might be better if she never surfaces again. There are maritime mysteries that leave behind clues, theories, and possibilities for explanation. Then there are disappearances so complete, so utterly without trace, that they transcend mystery and enter the realm of maritime legend. The SS Waratah represents the most terrifying category of all, a ship that vanished so thoroughly that even today, more than a century later, her fate remains one of the ocean's most closely guarded secrets. July 26, 1909. The SS Waratah, a passenger steamship carrying 211 passengers and 40 crew members, departed Durban, South Africa, bound for Cape Town. She was a magnificent vessel, built just 2 years earlier by Barclay Carroll and Company in Glasgow, designed to carry passengers and cargo between Britain and South Africa. At 500 feet long and weighing over 9,000 tons, the Waratah was considered one of the most advanced ships of her era. But there was something wrong with the SS Waratah from the moment she entered service. Passengers and crew members reported that she had an unnatural tendency to roll heavily in even moderate seas. Her stability seemed questionable, as if the ship was constantly fighting against forces that wanted to pull her beneath the waves. Some passengers refused to complete their voyages aboard her, claiming that the vessel felt cursed. Among those who disembarked early was Claude Sawyer, a mining engineer who had sailed aboard the Waratah from London to Durban. Sawyer later testified that he had experienced recurring nightmares during the voyage, dreams in which he saw the ship sinking and heard the screams of drowning passengers. The nightmares were so vivid and disturbing that he refused to book passage for the return journey, choosing instead to wait for another vessel. Sawyer's decision would save his life and provide one of the few first-hand accounts of what life aboard the SS Waratah was like during her final weeks. According to his testimony, the ship's behavior in rough seas was unlike anything he had experienced in decades of ocean travel. She would roll so severely that passengers and crew feared she might not recover, hanging at impossible angles for long, terrifying moments before slowly righting herself. But the Waratah's mechanical problems were only part of a larger pattern of disturbing incidents that seemed to follow the vessel wherever she sailed. Crew members reported seeing strange lights moving through the ship's corridors at night, lights that couldn't be traced to any electrical source. Passengers complained of voices calling their names from empty rooms and the sound of footsteps in areas where no one should have been walking. The ship's cats, normally reliable indicators of a vessel's condition, behaved strangely aboard the Waratah. They would refuse to enter certain areas of the ship, their fur standing on end as they hissed at empty air. Even more disturbing, several cats disappeared during voyages, vanishing from locked compartments with no explanation for how they had escaped or where they had gone. Captain Joshua Ilbery, a veteran sailor with 30 years of experience, seemed increasingly troubled as the Waratah's service continued. Fellow officers reported that he had become obsessed with the ship's stability, constantly checking calculations and making adjustments to cargo loading. He spoke privately of concerns about the vessel's design, fears that she was fundamentally unsuited for the rough seas around South Africa's coast. When the SS Waratah departed Durban on that July morning in 1909, several passengers and crew members later reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread as the ship pulled away from the dock. Unlike normal pre-voyage anxiety, this was a bone-deep certainty that something terrible was about to happen. Some passengers tried to disembark at the last minute, but the gangways had already been removed. The Waratah's planned route would take her around South Africa's treacherous coast, through waters known for sudden storms and dangerous currents. She was expected to make several stops along the way before reaching Cape Town, but she never arrived at her first scheduled port of call. Somewhere between Durban and Cape Town, the SS Waratah and everyone aboard her vanished into the South Atlantic without sending a single distress signal. When the ship failed to arrive on schedule, authorities initially weren't concerned. Delays were common in 1909, especially for vessels dealing with weather or mechanical issues. But as hours turned to days and days turned to weeks, it became clear that something catastrophic had happened to the SS Waratah. The search for the missing vessel became one of the most extensive maritime rescue operations of the early 20th century. Ships from multiple navies scoured the South Atlantic, covering thousands of square miles of ocean. Aircraft joined the search as aviation technology advanced. Coastal communities were alerted to watch for debris, bodies, or any sign of the missing ship, but the search found nothing. Not a single piece of debris, not one life jacket, not a body or personal belonging. The SS Waratah had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. 251 people had simply disappeared into the ocean's vast indifference, leaving behind only questions that grew more disturbing with each passing day. The complete absence of debris was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Waratah mystery. When ships sink, they leave traces. Wood floats, metal rusts and washes ashore. Personal belongings survive to tell tales of tragedy. But the Waratah left nothing behind, as if the ocean had opened up and swallowed her whole, then closed again without leaving any evidence of what had happened. As the search continued, investigators began uncovering details about the ship's final voyage that made her disappearance even more mysterious. The Waratah had been spotted by several vessels during her journey from Durban, but the sightings painted a disturbing picture of a ship in distress. The steamship Clan McIntyre reported passing the Waratah on July 26th, noting that the passenger ship appeared to be riding low in the water and listing slightly to one side. The officers of the Clan McIntyre later testified that something about the Waratah's appearance had troubled them enough to discuss it among themselves, but they hadn't considered the situation serious enough to offer assistance. This would be the last confirmed sighting of the SS Waratah, but other vessels in the area reported strange phenomena during the same time period. Several ships' captains logged unusual radio interference, described as voices speaking in languages they couldn't identify. Others reported seeing lights on the horizon that moved in patterns unlike any known navigation signals. The steamship Harlow reported an even more disturbing encounter. On the night of July 27th, the Harlow's crew heard what they described as screaming carried on the wind, sounds that seemed to come from the direction where the Waratah should have been. The screaming lasted for several hours, growing more desperate and then gradually fading until it was absorbed by the ocean's endless whisper. Weather reports from the time period revealed that a severe storm had passed through the area where the Waratah was last seen. But experienced maritime investigators knew that storms, even severe ones, rarely cause ships to disappear without trace. The Waratah was a modern vessel, built to withstand rough weather, and even if she had been overwhelmed by the storm, debris should have been found. The investigation took a more sinister turn when authorities learned about the ship's cargo manifest. In addition to passengers and their belongings, the Waratah was carrying a cargo that had been loaded in secrecy and wasn't fully documented in the official records. Some of the cargo compartments had been sealed by government officials, with instructions that they weren't to be opened except by specific authorities in Cape Town. What was in those sealed compartments? The official records were classified and remain so to this day, but maritime historians have suggested possibilities ranging from gold bullion to military weapons to diplomatic materials. Whatever the cargo was, it was valuable enough and sensitive enough to require extraordinary security measures. This mysterious cargo led some investigators to theorize that the SS Waratah had been the victim of piracy or sabotage. Perhaps someone had targeted the ship for her secret cargo, attacking her in a way that left no survivors and no evidence. But even this theory fell apart under scrutiny. Pirates would have needed to dispose of not just the ship, but also all 251 people aboard, plus all debris, plus all trace of their own operations. Such a feat would have been virtually impossible in 1909. As the years passed and the search for the SS Waratah continued sporadically, more disturbing reports began to surface from the waters where she had vanished. Local fishing communities along the South African coast spoke of ghost ships seen on foggy nights, vessels that appeared briefly on the horizon before vanishing again. The descriptions of these phantom ships matched the Waratah's profile exactly. Sailors reported hearing sounds from beneath the waves in the area where the Waratah disappeared, sounds described as metal groaning under pressure, as if a ship far below was still fighting against the ocean's crushing embrace. Some claimed to hear voices calling for help from depths where no living person could survive. Even more disturbing were reports from passengers aboard other vessels traveling the same route. Multiple witnesses described seeing faces in the water, the faces of people who appeared to be trying to surface but never quite breaking through the waves. These sightings always occurred in the same general area where the Waratah was believed to have vanished. Marine archaeologists have launched numerous expeditions to find the wreck of the SS Waratah, using increasingly sophisticated technology to scan the ocean floor. Sonar has detected anomalies that could be shipwrecks, but every investigation has ended in disappointment. Either the objects turn out to be natural formations or they disappear between sonar sweeps, as if the ocean itself is protecting its secrets. One expedition in the 1990s reported finding debris that appeared to match the Waratah's construction, but when they returned to the site with recovery equipment, nothing was there. The ocean floor showed no signs that anything had ever been present, no depression in the sediment, no disturbance of marine life. It was as if the debris had been an hallucination shared by multiple trained investigators. The most recent search efforts have focused on advanced deep-sea scanning technology, but these have revealed something even more disturbing than an empty ocean floor. In the area where the SS Waratah is believed to have sunk, Sonar operators report readings that don't make sense. Objects that appear on one sweep disappear on the next. Depth measurements vary impossibly between scans. The instruments themselves seem to malfunction when focused on specific coordinates, as if something below is actively interfering with the technology. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the SS Waratah mystery is the pattern it represents. She wasn't the first ship to vanish completely in those waters, and she wasn't the last. The South Atlantic Ocean off the coast of South Africa has claimed vessels throughout history, swallowing them so completely that no trace remains. Local maritime folklore speaks of a hungry ocean that takes not just ships and lives, but the very memory of what it has consumed. The SS Waratah reminds us that despite all our technology, all our understanding of the ocean's behavior, there are still forces at work in the depths that operate according to laws we don't comprehend. The complete disappearance of 251 people and a 500-foot steamship challenges our most basic assumptions about what's possible in the natural world. More than a century after her disappearance, the SS Waratah continues to haunt maritime investigators and ocean researchers. She represents the ultimate maritime mystery. Not just a ship that sank, but a vessel that was erased from existence so completely that she might never have sailed at all, were it not for the records of those who watched her depart and the memories of those who never returned. The ocean keeps its secrets jealously, but some secrets are so terrible that perhaps they're better left undisturbed. In the case of the SS Waratah, the complete absence of answers might be more merciful than the truth of what really happened during those final hours when 251 souls vanished into the South Atlantic's endless darkness. Conclusion and call to action. As you lie there in the darkness tonight, listening to these tales of maritime terror, remember that these aren't just stories from a distant past. The ocean that claimed the Mary Celeste, the Ourang Medan, the Carroll A, Deering, the MV Joyita, and the SS Waratah is the same ocean that surrounds our world today. The same dark waters, the same mysterious depths, the same forces that we still don't fully understand. These 5 mysteries represent just the beginning of the ocean's catalog of terror. For every ship we've discussed tonight, there are dozens more that have vanished without explanation. Hundreds of incidents that challenge our understanding of what's possible in the natural world. The sea doesn't give up her secrets easily, and perhaps that's for the best. Some truths might be too terrible for the human mind to fully comprehend. Some mysteries might be better left unsolved. But if you're fascinated by the unexplained, if you crave more stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about our world, then you need to watch my video about the 10 most haunted places in America. These locations, scattered across our own country, harbor secrets just as terrifying as anything the ocean has hidden in its depths. From abandoned asylums where the screams of the past still echo through empty corridors, to historic battlefields where the dead refuse to rest in peace. These places will show you that horror isn't confined to the distant ocean. It exists right here, in places you might drive past every day without realizing the darkness they contain. Click on that video now, but I warn you, once you start down this path of exploring the unexplained, there's no turning back. The mysteries will follow you, the questions will haunt your dreams, and you'll find yourself looking at the world around you with new eyes, wondering what other secrets are hiding just beneath the surface of everyday reality. Sweet dreams, and remember, the ocean is always watching, always waiting, and it never forgets those who dare to uncover its darkest secrets.